Thank you very much. Thank you, Saul, and thank you very much, everybody else who is online, especially participants at this year's version of APORDE. My intention in the course of this lecture is to make the point that African countries have been undiscriminating consumers of conventional wisdom in development policy advice, right from the post-independence era, with troubling consequences for socio-economic development. At this point, I would like to share a screen if it's possible. Right. So basically, I wanted to argue that when we look at the African development trajectory, we find that African countries have just tended to take on conventional wisdom in economic policy advice. And I'm saying that we need to be careful in doing so. And the starting point is that we have to realize that Africa is a big continent. And then I would outline some of the major development paradigms that have been used in Africa to try and show that even though the policies have been developed elsewhere, they're often designed for other purposes distinct from promoting African development. And after highlighting some of these development paradigms, I will speak to some of the consequences and try to offer some potential remedial actions. On the issue of Africa, it's a continent and not a country. I know it's important to emphasize that Africa is a continent, not a country. People are so used to referring to Africa as one entity, but it might be useful to remind us that in terms of geography, you can fit China, India, the continental United States, and most of Western Europe and Eastern Europe into Africa and still have some space to spare. And I think also we have to remember that there are over 2,000 languages in Africa. So it's one of the most diverse continents in linguistic terms. And of course, I agree that there are many similarities between African countries, and that we should take these in account when talking about the continent, such as the colonial heritage, which we all, of course, share, the having an overwhelmingly young population, having high poverty rates, being commodity dependent, having a large informal sector, and such like. So I do agree that there are similarities, but the point I wanted to make is that there are also differences, and these differences matter for development and matter for policy making. For instance, individual countries, we all know, have interests that they pursue vis-a-vis other countries. A very good example, which has been in the public consciousness of recent, has been the race to the bottom in terms of granting tax incentives to attract multinationals into their countries. But I think it's also important to emphasize that we all have different histories, different experiences of social and political organization. And I think that those are also important to bear in mind when we discuss African development and policy making. For instance, the political settlements framework, which I know would have been mentioned in the course of the lectures, reminds us that knowing the distribution of organizational power in societies requires understanding their historical and sociological makeups, as well as their ideological and identity cleavages. I then try to show how I think that we've been undiscriminating consumers of conventional wisdom. And that is one particular area of similarity that I think that we have. And I think this is aptly demonstrated by the widespread adoption at various times of whichever development paradigm was orthodoxy of the time, starting from the era of independence with dirigism or state-led development, structural adjustment programs, poverty reduction strategies, and even in some misguided instances, the developmental state. So in terms of dirigism and state-led development, what I have done, just for purposes of convenience, is to try and show some of the policies and some of the policy orientation. But before I go there, sort of speak to the background of some of these policies, basically arising, of course, after the end of the Second World War and the push for independence, the empirical evidence experience of the Keynesian Revolution, rapid industrialization in the Soviet Union, wartime planning during the Second World War, and even the subsequent implementation of the Marshall Plan in Europe that gave newly independent countries some sense that the governments could intervene successfully to bring about rapid improvement in economic conditions. I think this approach was also underpinned by various theoretical issues like the Harrod-Doman model, the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, and such theories, which also helped African countries to believe that it was best for them, in the spirit of decolonization and self-reliance, to move towards industrialization. Of course, also part of the theoretical underpinnings at that time was the study of market failures, through which governments were expected to supply public goods, compensate for externalities, mitigate market power, and bridge information asymmetries. So in this table, I've tried to show very crudely some of the policy orientation of that era, which some would say lasted till about 82 from the early 60s. So planning was active. There was strong belief in price controls, the control for inflation. There were fiscal policies were kept soft. There was no real talk about hard budget constraints. The financial sector accommodated directed credit allocation to specific sectors. Monetary policy emphasized fixed exchange rates, fixed interest rates. Exchange rates, of course, were fixed, and we had foreign exchange controls. Foreign trade, we had high tariffs and quantitative restrictions. Industrial policy was import substituting. Enterprise ownership, strong belief in state ownership, especially of commanding height of the economy, and the public sector that saw a central role for the bureaucracy. These policies were widespread in Africa at that time is not in doubt, and even the Berg report of the World Bank, which signaled the change in course of their attitudes towards Africa, remarked on the extraordinary degree of similarities of the policies that they wanted to change. And I think, indeed, state-led development came to grief in the early 1980s due to a combination of several factors, including the commodity price shocks of the late 70s and subsequent collapse of commodity prices in the 1980s, the difficulties of import substitution industrialization in the face of foreign exchange constraints, sharp reductions in international financial flows as a result of the Mexican debt crisis, and stagflation in financial centers like the United States and the United Kingdom. And the crisis was reflected, I think, in terms of declining per capita incomes, declining GDP growth rates, increased external debt burdens, deteriorating terms of trade, sharply reduced financial flows, and poor sectoral performances, even in agriculture, not to talk of mining and manufacturing. So it was claimed, for instance, in that same World Bank report, the Berg report, that the real incomes of 2/3 of Africans was lower in 1985 than in the mid-70s. But there was a crisis, no doubt. But I think the situation also provided an opening for those of the new liberal bent to introduce ideological considerations into development policy making, especially by limiting the role of the state. The World Bank, in one of its publications at the time, said bluntly that the public sector lies at the core of the stagnation and decline in growth in Africa. Of course, this then led to the adoption of what became of structural adjustment policies, also known as the Washington Consensus. So we found that in addition to poor economic outcomes and neoliberal considerations, structural adjustment policies were also introduced as an assertion of monoeconomics. In other words, all economics apply to all societies equally, and the rejection of structuralism the structuralism which underpinned the region's management. There was also something, as Tandeka Kandawiri, may he rest in peace, put it, the conceptualization of development as something eminent in the market system, with the price mechanism seen as sufficient for growth. So in addition to the ascending, at that time, rational expectations theory, there was also, I must say, legitimate criticisms about government interventions, with it being pointed out that the state was not omniscient, it was not omnipotent, and certainly in many cases was not benign. And so what you then found was that African countries, under, of course, pressure from developed countries and influential financial institutions, impose a set of conditions as a precondition for debt rescheduling or even aid flows. And so I've tried to, again, very broadly and very almost crudely, try to capture some of the policies and some of the policy orientation that took place, such that by 1989, the Economic Commission for Africa was reporting that at least 33 out of the 50 member states were already implementing stabilization or structural adjustment policy of some sort. The mantra being to stabilize, liberalize, and privatize. And so you see, in terms of policy, you see planning and none, it was discouraged. Prices were liberalized, the mantra was getting prices right. Fiscal policy, of course, tighter budgets and reduction of fiscal deficits. In terms of financial policy, again, liberalization, called financial deepening, with including the scrapping of credit control, credit allocation guidelines. Monetary policy freed up, liberalized, higher interest rates, reduced credit creation. We had exchange rates were liberalized, devaluation and floating exchange rates. Foreign exchange regime liberalized with the lowering of tariffs and the removal of quantitative restrictions. Industrial policy was discouraged. Enterprise ownership emphasis was on privatization of state-owned enterprises or public enterprises. And the public sector, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the idea was to reduce them in role and in size. But having said that, I would say that the candid assessment of structural adjustment policies and programs in Africa was that they failed so abysmally that the 1990s came to be known as the lost decade of African development. To quote Linda and Pritchett in 2004, a big fact of the 1982 to 2002, a big fact of 1982 to 2002 is the collapse of sub-Saharan Africa, which has by now become so complete as to force itself into world consciousness. Nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa has been transformed from the heady optimism and the enormous promise of early independence to almost unspeakable suffering. I think it was about this time also that the Economist magazine did us the honor of branding Africa in highly negative terms. Now, what were the reasons for the failure of structural adjustment policies? And I think some, of course, range from the failure from weak theoretical foundations to the fact that they took very little account of the institutional and political makeup of African countries. Indeed, structural adjustment programs did not deliver on their promises. So we had low growth, collapse in per capita incomes, increases in inflation, little or no improvements in investment, a very high debt burden, rising interest rate payments, and such like. And I think in structural adjustment programs also suffered from the fallacies of false identification and reproducibility. By that I mean false identification in the sense that they drew a false dichotomy between the experience of import substitution and export orientation in East Asia, and also emphasized the mythical minimalist state in East Asian countries. The problem of reproducibility arose from the assumption that conditions under which East Asia countries developed, especially with regard to the international environment and state capacity, could be readily replicated during the period of structural adjustment policies. I would just add that a lot of economic development paradigms suffer from this problem of reproducibility. And then there was, of course, this period of add-ons where we had good governance, PRSPs, MDGs, and the like. Now, given the obvious failures of structural adjustment, the advocates of the Washington Consensus had to find excuses and giving their investments in pushing this worldview, they resorted to blaming poor implementation, corruption, poor institutions, bad governance, and the like. So the outcome we had from about the early 2000s till as recently as the global financial crisis were add-ons, what some people have referred to, I think Roderick referred to as augmented Washington Consensus. Then, of course, the World Bank introduced poverty reduction strategy papers, and the world, in its wisdom, introduced the Millennium Development Goals. Good governance and regulatory approaches were emphasized as part of add-ons or propagated in their own rights. Consequently, governance requirements were added to conditionalities, such as democracy, anti-corruption, independent central banks, improved property rights regimes, improved corporate governance, social safety nets, and such like. The problem of the add-ons, in my view, was that they were just that. They did not address the limitations of the neoliberal worldview and the problems of reproducibility. Equally important in many instances, they put the cart before the horse in the sense that the best practice institutions being urged on developing countries were a result of and not the cause of development in the more advanced economies. The global crisis of 2007-2008, I think, damaged the neoliberal plan. Apart from the fallout of poorly regulated financial markets, the resort of developed countries to bailing out companies, injecting liquidity, easing credit, showed that the story of minimal state intervention was a rather hollow one. But then, we then found ourselves in a situation in which African countries had for at least 40 years been involved in absorbing conventional wisdom from around the world. And I think that this had consequences, serious consequences that we continue to battle today, including continuing economic crisis, incoherent policies, loss of policy space, loss of public sector capacity, financialization and deindustrialization, and the chasing of red herrings and invading policy measures. So in terms of economic crisis, for instance, in spite of the 60 years of development policy advice, there's not much to write home about the economic performance in Africa. With the exception of Ethiopia, which is unfortunately in crisis at the moment, all the supposedly successful African countries or economies like Botswana, Mauritius, and Rwanda are special cases. Again, the large number of people living in poverty in the continent is reflected in the experience of the larger economies. Nigeria, 46%, South Africa, 26%. While the poorest countries in the world are in Burundi, Central African Republic, Madagascar, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. And meanwhile, the overall poverty in Africa, while in decline in relative terms, the number of people in actual poverty is increasing because of population growth rates. In addition, African countries have very high rates of unemployment, with South Africa at 34%, Nigeria 33%, Angola 31%. Youth employment is even higher in many of these countries. Perhaps most worrying in my view is that the recent celebrated growth, which led to the Africa Rising narrative, might have been a result of the commodity supercycle brought about by historically high and sustained growth in China and India. The fact is that growth in a country like mine, Nigeria, tracks the growth of oil prices very closely. So, for instance, I've just shown the graph of Nigerian GDP growth and oil prices, and you can see that there's a very close correlation between the two. But then the other issue I think that arose apart from continued economic crisis was policy incoherence. I think the single greatest source of incoherence of policy was a stoppage of planning and the lack of viable visions to provide economic direction to economic actors, which was closely related, of course, was a lack of coordination. What the absence of planning and coordination meant in effect was that some parts of government would adopt policies or undertake programs without addressing a potential conflict with other policies or other programs being undertaken in other parts of government. Of course, then there's also the temporal policy incoherence that arises from using a jumbled up toolbox of past policy preferences. There are examples in which policies from the era of dirigism are being mixed with those from the structural adjustment era. For instance, there's a hankering after import substitution programs in many countries, while the subsisting trade policy regime is that of liberalization. Then again, there's the loss of policy space and policy and accompanying policy timidity. One huge consequence of the imposition of structural adjustment programs on African countries and, of course, other developing countries was a loss of policy space due to conditionalities and international rules drawn up in forums like the WTO, and now increasingly by the OECD in the case of international taxation. Also, policies that seemed voluntary at the time and that were adopted by countries were in actual fact not truly voluntary, in the sense that countries adopted what they thought was required of them in order to get assistance from donors. And I think this point was made by UNCTAD in a publication that it issued in 2002 in addressing the issue of the poverty reduction strategy papers. Then one fallout of the loss of policy space, I think, was an accompanying timidity in African countries to try policies that had not been certified, in quote, by powerful countries and institutions. I recall at a time that several African countries were worried about introducing industrial policies that had worked in the past in other emerging economies. Some of these policies, such as the imposition of performance requirements and export targets, were no longer allowed under WTO structures, and countries were worried about running foul of such requirements. And this was one of the motivations behind the work we carried out on transformative industrial policy for Africa in ECA. And I think we worked with Hajun Jang led that study for us. And this was in contrast, for instance, to the experiences of Korea and Taiwan, where advice given by US development experts was noted, very politely noted, and also equally politely ignored. And then the countries moved on to do what they wanted to do, despite the fact that they relied on the US for aid and market access. There was also a decline in public sector capacity, and I'd like to stress that one of the most damaging effects of being an undiscriminating consumer of conventional wisdom was the loss of state capacity. Apart from a loss of morale arising from a sharp decline in civil service salaries due to devaluation and falling government revenues, state capacity was also weakened by a resort to exit and survival strategies such as moonlighting. Two quotes from diametrically different approaches tell the story well. The first I take from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which in 2005 stated, "The public sector in sub-Saharan African countries has weakened during the past 2 decades. The share of government revenue in the gross domestic product has fallen. The civil service has shrunk in size, and real wages in the public sector have declined. Thus, the capacity of the public sector to plan and execute development policies and programs and to manage the national economy remains limited." The World Bank, on its own part, in spite of its role in doing the damage, had this to say in 1997. "As often happens with such radical shifts in perspective, countries sometimes tended to overshoot the mark. Efforts to reduce government spending and borrowing were uncoordinated, and the good was often cut as the bad. The result was seen most starkly in Africa, the former Soviet Union, and even parts of Latin America. And that was the neglect of state vital functions, threatening social welfare and eroding the foundations of market development. This damage to public sector capacity was, of course, more due to structural adjustment than to dirigism. But we should not forget that the civil service at independence inherited some of the practices of colonial rule. And this means that the high perks and the high authority of civil services were available only to the educated few. It was only a question of time before limited financial resources came up against the large numbers of people being educated and for whom the public sector job was the natural aspiration. I think one major consequence of the erosion of public service capacity was that when external interests then decided that planning, provision of infrastructure, industrial policy, and such like were needed after all, it was found, and I'm quoting Tandeka from 2014, it was found that there was simply no national planners, no industrial economists, no urban economists, no transport economists, no health economists. In other words, when the capacity was needed, it had been so eroded that it could not be brought into play. Another issue I would like to speak about as a consequence of some of these policies was the increasing financialization of our economies and accompanying deindustrialization. By financialization, I'm referring to the process by which financial institutions and markets, banks, stock exchanges, non-bank financial institutions, increase in size and influence in an economy. At a simply anecdotal level, the influence of finance ministries over planning and sectoral ministries was evident in my time at ECA when we had to headline our annual meeting of economic development and planning ministers with that of finance ministers. So it became the meeting of finance, development, and economic planning ministers, whereas it used to be meeting of economic development and planning ministers. And again, in my country, the best known businessmen are bankers as opposed to the few who the whole continent knows, like Dangote, that are investing in the real sector. Certainly, the committee of bankers here, headed by the central bank governors, wields more influence on economic policy than the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. Domestic industry in Africa has been negatively also affected, of course, by devaluations, which have increased the cost of inputs, the imports of capital and intermediate goods, as well as higher interest rates resulting from financial liberalization, and also competition with imported goods due to the liberalized foreign exchange and trade regimes. Yet there is nowhere in my knowledge in the world where economic transformation has taken place without the benefits of widespread manufacturing. I think India's service sector, which is widely acclaimed, may in fact just have played the role that agriculture played elsewhere, that is, of providing a surplus to support industrial development. Another key consequence of unreflective adoption of conventional wisdom, I think, has to do with the fact that a lot of African countries are spending time chasing red herrings and evading policy measures. So, for instance, African countries are caught up in trying to appear democratic and to practice good governance by tackling corruption and promoting transparency and accountability in the mistaken belief that these are requirements for development based on the experience of Western countries. They therefore spend a great deal of time on maintaining the electoral cycle, observing term limits, establishing anti-corruption agencies, undertaking peer reviews, and such activities. The thing, though, is that these things have no direct relationship with development per se. At the same time, the citizens, in the face of increasing economic challenges, resort to short-termism and exploration of exit options, such as capital flight and economic migration. Indeed, the struggle to survive in the face of crisis and economic uncertainty leads to ignoring of laws and such as relate to street trading, erection of illegal structures, illegal connection to power grids, disregard for legal requirements, and like the registration of business and non-compliance with health and environmental standards. There's also widespread disrespect for fiscal obligations like tax evasion or the payment of municipal dues due to low tax morale. So, given this gloomy situation, are there remedies, if any? And I think I will speak to the fact that there are some remedies. I think the first is that we must acknowledge that politics matters. We have to rebuild state capacity. We have to introduce transformative industrial policy. And we have to learn from developmental states. Politics matters because, for instance, as the political settlements framework reminds us, powerful organizations in a society can stymie well-intentioned policies. This means that policymakers must assess how, and I'm quoting Mushtaq, policymakers must assess how specific institutions and policies can be designed to achieve particular objectives, given the high likelihood of such distortion. In other words, we have to consider when we protect industry, for example, how the power configurations will enable the use of reciprocal control mechanisms, which are so important if industrial policy is to succeed. I think politics also matters at the global level because conventional wisdom reflects international configurations of power. While individual countries might not be able to do much about this, there is value in contesting in the marketplace of ideas. The African Alternative Framework for Structural Adjustment Programs, AFSAP, was an effort led by the Economic Commission for Africa under Adeyemi, and he referred to the dynamics at that time as the battles for the African mind. And I think this is why programs like APORDE are also very important. Another reason why politics matters is because of the importance of ideology or the specification of normative standards to promote a national value system that can help reduce individualistic free riding and the cost of exchange due to information asymmetries. I think it's also important as a remedy to rebuild state capacity. I think that if economic development in Africa is to truly take off, it will be essential to rebuild or strengthen state capacity. This will not be easy because bureaucracies are bastions of process and tradition, and bad practices may have fossilized over time. However, I think it's not impossible if there is a focus on meritocratic recruitment, including through competitive exams, improvements in morale, such as by making the leadership class in the civil service feel special. What we have in Nigeria, we've introduced what we call a presidential cohort of civil servants who are mid-ranking civil servants who are selectively selected competitively, trained, and then assigned to ministerial offices or offices of PANSEX so that they can work very closely and be mentored as the time goes on in policy making, but also serve as a link to the wider civil service over time of young people who have worked on cutting-edge policies. And that improvement in morale would also, of course, require improvements in salaries. There's no point putting someone in charge of billion naira projects if you are paying them the pittance, sometimes not worth any more than $100 to $200 a month. And so what you found that Lee Kuan Yew, for instance, in Singapore, and I think Nelson Mandela to some extent in South Africa, at the very onset said that they looked at civil service salaries and tried to adjust them. Otherwise, there'll be no point entrusting vital government policies to such a class. And so I think it was important to look at the remuneration of civil servants. We're trying to do so here as well. Very uphill task in the face of limited revenues. But it's also important to do so to prevent internal and external brain drain. Internal brain drain, of course, from the public service to the private sector, and external brain drain abroad. Essentially, and I think it's important to bear in mind what civil servants used to say in the heyday of structural adjustment programs, that you pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. And I think it's something that we must take into account as we move forward. I think it's also important for our countries to adopt transformative industrial policies. And by that, I'm talking about policies that will help to stimulate growth and reset economic opportunities, especially given the damage wrought by COVID-19. And transformative industrial policies are one in which governments give leadership in setting industrial policy objectives, particularly because the market-led pace, if there's any sort of thing, is too slow. Transformative industrial policy, and this is drawing from the work that was done, as I said, under the leadership of Hajun, will focus on manufacturing, which is key for economic transformation because of its productivity and growth promoting qualities, and for learning by doing. And I must add that smokestack, the industries don't have to be smokestack industries, and they can actually, as in the case example of salmons in Chile, not necessarily be pure manufacturers, insofar as there's opportunity for learning and enhancement of productivity. I think transformative industrial policies will enable African countries to benefit from industrialization without the limits or the limitations of previous import substituting industrialization models. That is, they should overcome the lack of competitiveness that arises also partly from the lack of exposure to export markets, the structural balance of payments constraints which continue to be very much there, and which a country like Ethiopia faced even at the height of its success with manufacturing, having to go and borrow, I think, some $3 billion from the UAE to overcome their balance of payments crisis. And of course, most importantly, and I referred to it earlier, to be able to impose reciprocal control mechanisms, which would require some performance measures in exchange for the policy incentives granted to manufacturing enterprises. Then the last thing I would like to speak about is that we must learn from developmental states. And I say this clearly to say that this is not in the sense of developmental states being another new blueprint or set of one-size-fits-all best practice solutions, but rather by looking to those states and looking at what has been common in enabling their success. And some of them, for instance, include using their own, and I emphasize their own processes and procedures gleaned through successive trying and failing, flexibility to try and extract capital in order to implement plans, to target specific industries rather than generalize industrial policy, to resist political pressures domestically and internationally, and to generally turn around society towards promoting productivity and technological growth. So specifically, I think that some of the lessons that can be learned from developmental states then is, one, to improve coordination. In other words, since structural change, a quick structural change requires coordination, then our states must begin to look at how best to improve coordination so as to reduce transactions costs and minimize economic waste. I think we must also minimize macroeconomic volatility, by which I'm talking about avoiding the sudden and rapid changes in price levels, exchange rates, interest rate, budget deficits, and the balance of payment. In other words, not so much the absolute levels at any point in time, so much as the frequency of change, which exposes producers, especially in the private sector, to uncertainty and affects their long-run outlook. I think our states must also learn to play the entrepreneurial role of providing a vision, mobilizing resources, and assuming risk. And by assuming risk, I mean helping even private producers by providing them with the incentives and absorption of some of their costs in order to be able to take on high-risk new areas, to go into new areas of production. And I think, finally, our states must act as conflict managers in the sense that as economic change takes place, there will be conflicts, of course, between various social groups, social actors, and various interests. And there will be winners and losers, at least in the short term. And in that process, I think it's important for the state to act to mediate such conflicts, including through things like welfare arrangements, social investments, and such like, to improve opportunity and to help those who are losing out to acquire the skills that will enable them to find jobs in areas of the economy that are growing. I conclude by saying that I have deliberately left out regional integration. And the reason is basically because I agree that it holds potential. And I think that there's much to be done. But so far, I don't think the track record of regional integration has been as strong as it should be. There's been too much emphasis, in my view, on trade liberalization. And there's too much on building the paraphernalia of offices, establishing secretariats, adopting protocols. And I think it would be probably more valuable to try and build an ecosystem that promotes the development of regional value chains. In other words, I would rather see a more production-oriented regional integration approach than a trade liberalization approach. But I do realize that the benefits of regional integration include the ability for states to be able to bargain more successfully with other actors. And I therefore realized that in terms of power configuration, we would need to take regional integration into account. And having said that, I would like to stop and say that I've used work I've drawn from several works, and I've just put a bibliography there just to show that I've drawn from some of the work by Chang, some of my own work, some of the work by Khan, Lindow and Pritchett, Kadawire, Pempel, Roderick, and various UN organizations and the World Bank itself. And I think I'll leave it for that now. Thank you very much.